What's up, folks? Coach Bach here. I am redoing my video series on muscle tension, talking about anatomy and physiology and all the factors that go into how much muscle tension is generated in a movement. All right, I first did this, I think, 11 years ago on my old Jump Science channel. Redoing it now, we're going to have some updated research information, some improvements to the videos, hopefully. So I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully, at least a couple people out there are looking forward to it. So we are talking about the length tension curve of muscle. So looking at the graph here, we got muscle length on the x-axis, muscle tension on the y-axis, and then we have two different components to the tension, which are active and passive. Let's first look at this active component. So we've figured out this curve with isometric testing in research. Okay, it's mostly been done on animal muscle fibers, but humans as well. So imagine a muscle fiber that's hooked up to an apparatus, which is going to hold it at a constant length. Okay, so it's isometric testing. You activate the muscle with electricity and you give it, as much as it takes, like maximally activate it. So this is a reflection of maximum possible tension. All right, so that apparatus is going to hold it at a constant length and measure the force that is generated in that muscle fiber. Okay, so then you do that at different lengths of the fiber and you get these different data points on the graph, and that produces your curve for you. Okay, now they've done this with individual fibers, they've done it with muscle fascicles, so a bundle of fibers, and they've even done whole muscles, and they've done this, with a human on a machine of some sort. Okay, and it all produces a similar result. So the active tension curve is basically a parabola. It's just skewed to the left a little bit. Okay, so where does this active tension curve come from? For that, we're going to have to do a little anatomy. So let me flip my whiteboard around here. And we are going to look at what's called the sarcomere. All right, so the sarcomere, this graphic up here, is the contractile unit of muscle. In a muscle, you've got a whole bunch of muscle fascicles. Each fascicle is a bundle of fibers, okay? Each fiber, which is a muscle cell, has in it a bunch of myofibrils, okay? And each myofibril is composed of a bunch of sarcomeres lined up in a long chain. So we're talking about thousands of these in a myofibril to span the length of that muscle fiber. Okay, so each sarcomere is at resting length only a couple micrometers long, so a couple millionths of a meter long. So yeah, you can imagine it takes a whole bunch of them to span, the length of a muscle fiber. So a sarcomere has this ability to shorten and lengthen. Okay, and so it's only a couple micrometers of range there in a sarcomere, but if you have thousands of those in a row, then that can equate to, the large-scale movements that we have in our body. 3 different proteins, or 3 that we're going to look at, okay? We're not going to do all the details here. But so in the middle, you have this thick filament, which is made up of myosin protein, okay? On the sides here, you have the thin filament, which is made of actin protein. Okay, the actin is attached to these discs on the end. All right, and then we have titin protein, which is what myosin is anchored on. So it kind of keeps myosin in place in the middle there. So that's kind of a scaffolding that helps keep everything arranged correctly in relation to each other, all those different filaments. So how is muscle tension generated in the sarcomere? Well, there's a lot of steps in that process, starting with, activity in the brain. I encourage you to look that up. Physiology is awesome, okay? Use Google, use YouTube, learn all those steps. We're going to shortcut things a little bit here. Basically, when a nerve signal reaches a muscle, it stimulates a release of calcium in the muscle cells, okay? The muscle cells are muscle fibers, okay? So you got calcium flooding into the sarcomeres, and that triggers, again, I'm shortcutting a little bit here, but it triggers the myosin molecules to bind to the actin molecules. Okay? Keep in mind, this is a filament made of many molecules, and this is a filament made of many molecules. We're not talking about one molecule binding. Okay, so there's the myosin head, they call it. It's this like piece of the protein molecule. And after it binds to actin, that causes the molecule to want to change shape a little bit. So it binds to the actin and then pulls on it. Okay, and so that's called a myosin actin cross bridge. And that is where all your muscle tension comes from. All right, so keep the sarcomere in mind, and let's talk about where the length tension curve comes from. Okay, I'm gonna flip the board back around. Hopefully we're staying on camera here. All right, so this part of the active tension curve is called the ascending limb. All right, this is the plateau, and this is the descending limb. All right, so the plateau comes where you have the optimum overlap of those myosin and actin filaments. Okay, so you get the most cross bridging and you can generate the most tension. The descending arm of the curve comes from having not enough overlap, right? So the sarcomere is lengthening, the filaments are pulling apart, they have less overlap, less cross bridges, less muscle tension. All right, and then the ascending arm over here comes from too much overlap, which back when I was in school, I think they said that the active sites on the myosin and actin filaments didn't line up as well on that section, and that was kind of the explanation. I think you also get this kind of converging of the structures, like the actin on the two sides, and maybe even the titin protein getting balled up in there. You get some internal pressure from that kind of resists the shortening, and so that might be a factor. Turns out it's actually kind of a controversial topic, like where exactly this ascending arm comes from, like all the mechanisms that go into that. But basically, as the sarcomere gets shortened, too far, you do get a loss of active muscle tension. Here's a great study that summarizes this topic, gives a long history of the research and kind of the steps that we went through in discovering how all this works. All right, so then let's talk about passive muscle tension. So you might see a version of the curve that looks like this, where you have this passive tension curve that only kicks in at pretty long length. So when the sarcomeres are getting pulled pretty far apart, then you get this passive tension that kicks in. So if you go back to the sarcomere, we talked about the titin protein here that the myosin is anchored on. Well, if the two ends of the sarcomere, the discs, are getting pulled further and further apart, eventually you get to like the end of this titin molecule, right? And so if you get far enough out, that titin starts to stretch, and that creates passive tension. And they say that titin is responsible for a good portion of the passive tension that we see when a muscle is getting lengthened far out. The other passive tension would come from the connective tissue framework of the muscle. So your muscle fibers and your muscle fascicles and the whole muscle all have a connective tissue sheath. And so, as you're stretching out a muscle, you're going to start to stretch that out too and get passive tension from that. So back to the length tension curve. If we do a total tension curve, where we're adding the passive and active together, that would be basically just on the active line up until the point where that passive kicks in, and then it would start to add those two together, okay? And so you'd end up with something kind of like that. Now, this curve, in the past, when I learned this, it didn't really sit well with me, because you notice that at long lengths, we have this drop in tension. And to me, that didn't quite line up with all the evidence we have that training muscles at long length is good for strength and hypertrophy and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so that kind of puzzled me. I was like, if we're training muscles out here and they're generating a lot less tension than here, why do we have so much results from training at long lengths? And, that doesn't quite make sense. So then I was like, well, maybe the muscles just never really get out there, right? Maybe they're only operating here. And maybe I was somewhat correct to suspect that. And so maybe the passive tension just isn't really a factor, right? But then at the same time, I thought, if I go like full range on, let's say, a push-up where I start to feel a stretch in the front of my shoulder, I feel like I'm not all the way out here where I have like no active tension and I'm starting to get the passive tension. I feel like those things can kind of exist pretty well together. And so this just kind of left me with a lot of questions. And it turns out I wasn't the only one with questions. Okay, so in the history of elucidating this curve in the research, there's some data that really didn't line up with it. Okay, so one would be looking at muscle action that is shortening versus lengthening. So that's concentric versus eccentric muscle action. And what they found, so one, people are stronger eccentrically, but there's something in particular that they found is that even if you equate the work between concentric only action or eccentric only action, if you equate the work, the eccentric action generates way less heat in the muscle because it requires way less energy. So it's like drastically more efficient. Okay? And people struggle to explain that just using like the cross bridge theory, right? Which it's called the sliding filament theory, right? So there are some differences, in cross bridge variables like attachment and detachment and maybe the force per cross bridge in shortening versus lengthening. But they were not enough to explain the drastic difference in efficiency. Okay. Now, if you want a real life demonstration of that efficiency, try walking up a steep hill versus walking down it, or like hiking a mountain up versus hiking it down. On the way up, your legs are going to be burning. You're going to be huffing and puffing. It's going to be a challenging climb. And then on the way down, even though you're doing a lot of the same work by having to control yourself lowering down or having to decelerate yourself when you take those steps down, you're doing a lot of the same work, and yet you will not find yourself getting nearly as tired on the way down. Okay, so there's a real life demonstration of that. And that difference in efficiency between the two things is not explained by sliding filament theory. And then there's this other bit of data that really does not make sense. And this comes from the isometric testing that I was talking about. And so what they found is if you activate the muscle fiber at a shorter length, then you lengthen it like out here, and then you do the isometric testing immediately after lengthening it, they found that this tension will actually stay really high out here where the active tension is supposed to be dropping off. Okay? And not only does it stay high for a moment, but it's sustainable. So you can actually get sustained high tension, which tells you, again, there's an efficiency that's happening there where it doesn't require nearly as much energy as you would think. And again, that sustained high tension at long lengths where the sarcomeres are getting pulled apart, that is not explained by just cross-bridge theory and sliding filament theory, okay? So there was some pieces here that did not make sense. And that brings us to what I'm calling the titin revolution. All right, so let's go back to the sarcomere again. And remember this titin protein here, which is what the myosin filament is anchored on. And it's important. It provides this scaffolding to keep everything positioned, but it doesn't just do that, okay? So we talked about how if the sarcomere gets pulled apart far enough, the titin stretches out and starts to create passive tension. But what we've figured out now is that, one, when calcium floods the sarcomere, it actually binds to titin, and that increases the stiffness of the titin molecule, okay? So that's a small factor. The bigger factor is, again, when calcium floods the sarcomere. So this is when you activate the muscle. It's not if you are relaxed, okay? When you activate the muscle, titin actually binds to actin, all right? So I put these little squigglies in here to demonstrate that titin has like some slack in it, okay? And so if there's slack in it, then again, you're gonna have to stretch out the sarcomere pretty far in order to get tension out of the titin, that passive tension. But imagine if a point on the titin molecule here just bound to actin, that kind of just takes that slack out of the equation. And so now you can start to get passive tension much sooner as the sarcomere is lengthening. All right. So long research process, a lot of hypothesis and trying to figure that out. I'd say it's pretty well confirmed, although, still learning all the details here. Okay, but so that has a significant impact on the passive tension curve in the length tension curve. All right, so if we go back here, with titin binding to actin, you can get this passive tension curve that kicks in a lot sooner, right? So if you have that passive tension starts here and then slopes up, then that means the total tension curve, we talked about how it dropped down before when the passive tension only kicks in back here. But if that passive tension kicks in sooner, then that starts adding to the active tension here. And so now your total tension is like something there. And that makes more sense with all the research and the data we have on training muscles at long lengths. Okay, we have a lot of tension out here at long lengths, whether it's just active or it's a combination of active and passive. We got a lot of tension. Okay, so yeah, in the past, I saw the length tension relationship with this passive curve out here. And then I also saw it with the passive curve in here. And I was like, well, which one is it? Because this makes a really big difference. Turns out this passive tension curve, it's tricky, right? Because it's passive tension, but only when the muscle fiber is activated. All right, so I cleaned up the curve here. This is kind of your active length tension relationship. So again, you got that active parabola, you got that passive tension curve that kicks in much sooner, and then you have your total muscle tension here. So I want to give you a few research papers that you can read if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the science here, the history of how we figured this stuff out about titin. Okay, so here's a few study titles that you can read through for that. Now, I want to say we're still figuring that titin thing out. So one of those studies even calls titin a tunable spring. If you just completely relax the muscle, you have no activation, so you got that passive curve out here. And then we know if you're active, you can get the passive curve further in here. To what degree can that vary? To what degree can that be controlled, right? Can you kick it in at any point you want to, right? Is it basically like at whatever length your sarcomere is, you can attach titin to actin and start to get passive tension. And so theoretically, this curve could kind of kick in at any point, right? And do we do that differently in different movements? Is there a limit to how short we can be and get passive tension, right? Like, can we bring that all the way over here where it starts going up even sooner? A lot of questions still to be answered there. So with that kind of picture, let's do a little application of this information, right? What do we do with this? So first of all, the length tension curve is why training muscles at very shortened lengths is not generally viewed as being effective, okay? Not for hypertrophy, not for strength, it's not generally effective. Now, if you have a specific skill that you're trying to learn or a specific movement you're trying to learn that requires you to be strong at short muscle lengths, then you're going to have to train that. But in terms of creating general adaptations to make you good at a broad range of things, training at short lengths, generally not very effective. Okay, so we say that training muscles at long lengths is generally good because we get high tension, right? Now, is that a product of high active tension? Is that what makes it good? Is it about high passive tension? Is that what makes it good? Is it a combination of the two? right? Is one of those better than the other? Is there some type of like optimal length that we should be shooting for with muscles? Now, if you go down that road, it gets pretty complex. So a whole bunch of factors to keep in mind here. One, sarcomeres do not lengthen uniformly across a myofibril or across a muscle fiber, or certainly not, in a whole muscle where you have different fascicles and all this stuff. All your sarcomeres are not going to be at the same length. Okay, so even if you have like a hypothetical ideal position to strength train a muscle at, it wouldn't be the ideal position for every sarcomere, right? Or even for every part of the muscle. Another thing, a lot of times we have different muscles that act at the same joint. And so even if you identified an optimum joint angle for one muscle, you'd still have to find a different optimum joint angle for another muscle. Another thing, activation varies. All right, so you might have a muscle that is in a lengthened position, and so you might think this is the great position to train this muscle in, except, then the internal moment arm, so the leverage that muscle has, is actually low at that position, and because it's low, your body's not going to activate that muscle at a high degree because it's not in a good position to perform that task. And so, you thought it was an ideal position, but turns out it's not because the activation's not there. Also, the curve is adaptable. Okay, one way that we know for sure it's adaptable is through sarcomerogenesis, which is a long word that just means the adding of more sarcomeres in that long chain, in that myofibril, right? And so that has an impact on the curve, right? And so you might have thought that you were like training at one specific area, but then your muscles adapted and now it's actually a little different than it used to be, okay? Again, lots of complication here. Another complication, this is an important one, is different muscles can operate on different areas of the curve, right? Like anatomically, the range that a muscle operates in can exist on different areas of the curve. It's not, you're not necessarily going from here to there with your typical anatomical movements. Okay, so for example, I believe research shows that the biceps and triceps operate mostly on the ascending limb of the curve, right? And so they're going to generate more tension as you get them longer. And so that's, important information. But then also, maybe passive tension is not really going to be much of a factor for those training those muscles. Whereas the quads, the vastus muscles anyway, the medialis lateralis, they say that those operate mostly on the descending limb. Okay, and so then if you were just going for active tension, maybe you would actually train the quads at a little shorter length. But then also, if you do go longer length, passive tension is going to be playing a big role. And so maybe you need to do both or something, right? Again, lots of questions here. And then going back to the adaptation, right? They've even found a muscle can operate, more on one part of the curve in one population of people and a different part of the curve in a different population. So in one of those papers, they talked about, I think it was the rectus femoris, and it was runners and cyclists. And in one group, they found that the rectus femoris was mostly operating on the ascending limb, and then the other group they found was mostly operating on the descending limb, right? And that's a product of the adaptations to those activities. All right, so lots of complication. And lastly, you have to remember that there are different brands of hypertrophy or different brands of muscle architecture changes, right? So certainly we have lots of data on regional hypertrophy where certain types of training tends to produce hypertrophy on one region of the muscle versus another. And those regional differences tend to be a product of, again, adding sarcomeres in series. So that sarcomerogenesis, making the myofibrils longer, right? Versus adding sarcomeres in parallel, so making muscles thicker, okay? So you have, muscles getting longer versus getting thicker, and different training that tends to stimulate those adaptations, or, different muscles that tend to experience those adaptations. So, guys, there's a lot of things to keep in mind here. So with all of that in mind, it's very difficult to claim, like some ideal position for training. Okay. Maybe if you're talking about a singular muscle and a singular goal, like let's just say hypertrophy, maybe you could attempt to be like, okay, this is kind of the ideal joint angle we want to use or something, right? Or maybe you could cut it down like, okay, we want to do some work at this joint angle and some work at that joint angle. Maybe you could attempt that for a singular muscle and a singular goal. But if we're talking all muscles, even all muscles acting at one joint, or if we're talking about an entire muscle group that has differences between the, even the different parts of that muscle group, or if you're talking about all muscles and all movements, and you're picking something like one joint angle that is just optimum for everything, every muscle, every exercise, every goal that you might have, I mean, that is just so ludicrous. Just asinine, just brain dead, right? Like, I'm out of adjectives. You really just have to stick your head in the sand, ignore so much science, and just have like a cult-like belief in this magical joint angle to have that type of philosophy. Now, let me speak to my audience for a minute here. That's people interested in speed and jump training, right? Explosive performance. Are there specific takeaways from this for us? So I would say, yeah, training at long length is good, and that's still the case for people trying to do explosive performance, okay? But, maybe there's a little balance you have to have there, because you got to remember, if you're trying to do something like sprint really fast, well, then you need to get off the ground from a relatively straight leg position, not a lot of deep knee and hip flexion. And so you actually need to be producing elite muscle force at relatively short lengths. And so there may be a lot of good adaptations to training at long length. But if we, let's say you raise this curve in general, but it sort of shifts to the right because of sarcomerogenesis, because of maybe some other architectural adaptations. If it shifts to the right a little bit, where you actually end up with less tension on this, on the ascending limb, that could have a negative impact on your ability to get off the ground fast during a sprint, right? And so we talk about general strength training versus like max velocity, and how there can be an interference there. And, we talk about all the differences between those things, like producing force fast versus just producing maximum muscle force. And, we talk about fatigue and all these things, the influence on the nervous system. I think that muscle architecture or soft tissue architecture, the changes there are a potential source of interference, and it could show up in the length tension relationship. Okay. So, to get real practical with it, this would be why you would do, if you're a track athlete, let's say, and you need to be fast, you would do general strength training in the off season. And then when you get into, preseason and competitive season, you're going to shift your strength training strategy. And so, yeah, maybe it means in your off season, you do deep squats. And then in season, you just do higher box squats or half squats, right? Something like that. That's a pretty common strategy, kind of this general to more specific progression in the strength training. And part of the explanation for why that works might be found right here in the adaptations to the length tension curve. Okay. Then I would also say titin, right? This passive tension curve, that's potentially huge. And we're just starting to learn about it. We don't really have data that I've seen on adaptations in titin and changes in the passive tension curve. But there's this question, when it comes to sprint performance or, running and jumping off one leg, things where you're trying to get off the ground fast. There's this question of leg stiffness. How do we get it? What are the adaptations that give us that? And, leg stiffness comes from soft tissue stiffness, right? Like the musculotendinous unit has to be stiffer. And as we've learned about muscle tendon dynamics, we know that it's usually the tendon's going to do the lengthening, the muscle's going to stay pretty stiff. And so in pursuit of that muscular stiffness, is this passive tension curve actually a big contributor to that? I mean, maybe, we don't know, like, at what length really can we get that passive tension to kick in, and how big of a factor is that in something like a sprinting foot contact or a long jump foot contact. I'd say it's potentially a huge source of muscle stiffness. And so this could be one of the key differences between people that get off the ground fast and don't. Now, that's just a suspicion. I don't know it yet. But us learning more about titin and this passive tension curve is a realm of, potentially major enlightenment there. Okay? So some really exciting developments. And that's like the last 10 or 15 years we've figured this out about titin. Okay, so that was not even in my collegiate anatomy and physiology or strength and conditioning education. That is like recent stuff. All right, so that is the length-tension relationship of muscles. I hope you have found this informative, possibly enjoyable. I know there was kind of a lot packed in there, but I mean, that's anatomy and physiology for you, right? It's very complex, so if you're going to get into the science, you got to get into the science. This doesn't mean that training always has to be super complex. But yeah, the science behind it and some of the things to consider from the scientific viewpoint can be very, very complex, and there's still obviously like a million questions to be answered. All right, but hopefully you found this helpful. Next video is going to be on the force velocity curve, and that's going to be another monster. So looking forward to that.